So it wasn't that there was snow there, but it was freezing. It was freezing cold. And so I was doing really short days. Like one day, I think I did like 40 kilometers because I stopped for lunch in like a roadside restaurant. And the guy was really friendly and I was absolutely freezing. So I'm sitting around the fire. And then he was like, "Do you want to stay here?" And I was like, "Absolutely." Yes, I was. I don't need to go on anymore because it had been raining loads as well. So yeah, so that's kind of the difference. Like the comparison with an ultra race, you'd be like, "No, I've only done 40 kilometers a day. Probably should do a bit more." But when you're like cycle touring, you're like, "Yeah, sure, that's fine. I'll stay." Yeah, so I stayed with those people along the way like that.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners.
Hello, I'm your host Bella Malloy, and I'm very excited to introduce our guest for today's episode of the Seek Travel Ride podcast, Nikki Ray. It's fair to say the humble bicycle has shaped Nikki's life in a multitude of ways, from teaching adult refugees how to ride a bike for the first time, to crossing countries on a 10,000 kilometre solo cycle tour through West Africa, through to competing in challenging ultra-cycling races. Nikki has done this and so much more. She is a cycling instructor, human rights advocate, hill climb racer, and ultra-cyclist. She is a true adventurer in every sense of the word. So, without further ado, Nikki, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Bella, and thanks for that really nice and kind introduction. I really appreciate it.
I find it's always easy to be kind when you're just telling the truth, Nikki, and it was interesting, like learning so much about you in preparation for this show, just the things that I could keep adding into that introduction. I feel like there's so much I've possibly just left off. But we will explore more and more as the conversation flows. What I do like to do though, and it's a question I ask all of my guests first and foremost, is, do you remember the first bike you ever rode?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't think I have a really exciting story like some people might. And I'm not even sure if it was my bike. My sister had a bike that I think it had like tassely things coming out of the handlebars and a basket and stabilizers, which by the way, kids, like, don't put your kids on stabilizers. That's a separate topic. But I don't think I think it was my sister's bike. That's the first bike I remember. And I don't remember learning how to ride, which I really wish I did when I'm teaching other people how to, but I don't have that memory. I just have the memory of all of a sudden, like, being able to ride a bike, and then we'd go to Richmond Park, which is near I grew up. So yeah, sorry, not super interesting.
No, they don't have to be interesting. It's just how you genuinely discovered riding. And I love that that some of your memories are actually cycling through Richmond Park. I was fortunate to live in London in 2007, 2008, and we lived quite close to Richmond Park. And it was actually one of the things I really wanted to do was cycle there, but I didn't own a bike when I was in London, so it's still on my to-do list. But I always remember it was just such a beautiful, vast green space. So what a cool place to ride a bike as a kid.
It's so nice. So basically, there's an off-road trail around the outside called the Tamsin Trail, and we used to go there as kids, but not the whole way around because it's quite far. So just kind of along this like plateau. And it's so funny because we'd always talk about like, oh, these people cycling on the road, and we'd always think they were really stupid. Why are they cycling on the road? Why are they not going on the Tamsin Trail? And only like a few years ago, I became one of these people that cycles on the road in Richmond Park. It is quite nice because there's so many deer in the park, and it can be really beautiful, like at like sunrise and sunset times, and it doesn't take that long to get to. So now I understand why those people do that, but I always thought they were super weird when I was younger.
It is interesting when you remember things like that, and then all of a sudden you realise that you're the topic of what you thought in your head later. Nikki, as I said in my introduction, I feel like you have done so much, and a bicycle has sort of shaped a lot of what you have done. But for the benefit of our listeners, I always like to give my guests their own way of introducing themselves. So could you just give our listeners a summary of you?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question. So yeah, I live in London. I've been a cycling instructor for maybe about 8 years. And I think coming to that kind of changed a lot of my life. And I didn't cycle as a teenager, as like, which happens to a lot of teenagers regardless of gender, but happens to a lot of teenage girls. And I kind of found it again when I was at university, and I did this challenge fundraising thing to the Indian Himalayas. And I remember on that trip, I kept saying to myself over and over again, such an odd thing to say, but I was like, I'm having too much fun. Like, this is too much fun. This is amazing. And I think I found cycling much easier than some of my teammates who were not having so much fun. But yeah, so then from there I like started cycle commuting, and then like now cycling has become part of my life. I think I always have to have a thing that I'm doing. So when I was a bit younger, like dance was the main part of my life, and I used to do a lot of dancing from when I was like a teenager into like early 20s. And now I'm trying to come back to that a bit. And like, so I always thought of myself as an artistic person and never, ever, ever as a sporty person. And I wrote about this in a blog actually, of like why I always like, I don't know if I said hated sport, but why sport was never something that I associated with. And now I realize that I do, but it's always still individual sports and not team sports. So I've also done a bit of like climbing. When you go to a dance class, you're kind of an individual coming to the class. And especially with ultra distance races, which I've now kind of got quite into, you can ride as a pair, but I don't know if that's something I'll ever delve into. Like, it's always very much like I really like cycling my bike now in the middle of nowhere by myself, which I do appreciate that for some people that is probably be the polar opposite of what they would like to do or how they enjoy cycling. But yeah, just like I really like traveling as well to different countries and being in nature. So cycling has just I'm so glad that I discovered it, and this is why yeah, being a cycling instructor is really helpful because you can help other people to discover this joy. But then also now I work less as a cycling instructor because I now work for a refugee women's charity where I help lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women seeking asylum in this country. Which, yeah, I've always been interested in human rights and studied it in the past, and now I still do a bit of cycle instructing, but that's taken a little bit of a sidestep for the moment, but still very much like a hobby. I don't know. I don't know if I think about it as a hobby, but like outside of work, cyclist. Whereas before, all of my work was cycling instructing. So this has kind of been an interesting shift of late, but it doesn't mean that I'm doing less cycling necessarily.
No, and I guess while cycling instructing doesn't form your your day job, for lack of a better word, it certainly, I think, advancing the rights of minorities within minorities, as you do as well, without trivializing that. I know that for some, there are other aspects of cycling where we are a minority as well. So, for example, in cycle commuting, or in commuting terms, the cyclist is a minority too. But I wonder whether your relationship with cycling from that perspective is also whether there's learnings you've taken from you being your instructor there, from helping someone go through a vulnerability, for example, learning the art of balance for the first time, to then channeling how to assist someone with a vulnerability in another area as well. I know that's a drawn out tangent of a question there, but I hope you know where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if I'm actually exactly answering your question, but I think that so now it's very visible. Okay, so there have been loads of gains of diversity in cycling, but especially in fields like ultra distance cycling, it's really stark. Like I did the Trans Pyrenees race last year. I don't know if 150 people turned up to the start line, but the stats were 150 people, 11 were women, which is really crazy. But then also all of those women were white. So it's stark. But I guess maybe my awareness of that is more heightened because even when I wasn't teaching refugee women how to cycle, I was teaching people in my local area to cycle, who the majority of were women of color. So I've taught all of these women of color to cycle. They're out there, but then still, like when we look at cycling visibly, it's still predominantly white men who are cycling. So yeah, I guess like I have a heightened awareness, but everybody else should be able to see it too. I don't know. And thankfully, like lots of people are also interested and motivated to change the face of cycling as well. So that brings me like hope and joy. But yeah, doing things like this podcast better is really, really handy for people to kind of, maybe they haven't thought about it before, might allow people to kind of see cycling through a different lens, possibly.
And I think also, like, when we've got minorities with minorities, there's two sides of it. One, there's something I always remember learning in sort of diversity training was you can't be what you don't see. So, you know, if you don't see examples of something, then you don't see it for yourself, or you exclude yourself because you just feel it's not possible, rightly or wrongly. That it's just psychologically how that works. But also, on the flip side, when you're in the majority, you don't see the minority and you don't see the problem because it's not a problem for you. So you don't see a barrier because there's not been a barrier when you're in the majority. So I hope sort of helping to deliver those messages from both sides will help break down those barriers as well. I mean, the stat that you read there with the Trans-Pyrenees, it's an up and coming, very popular ultra cycling race. Less than 10% of the field is women, and then even then there's no women of colour or anything represented in that at all. It's quite a stark stat, which has me sad at present, but it would be interesting taking a line in the sand and looking at this, you know, next year, the year after, 5 years down the track. If we reflect and could go into the future, it would be interesting to see what that would look like.
Oh, definitely. And I think in the last few years, like a lot of change has started to happen and lots of groups have been started that are really like championing diversity, like in the cycling world. I do appreciate that sometimes I do like live in a bubble. So I feel like I sometimes live in like an Instagram bubble of like I mostly only follow female cyclists or like ultra distance races or like inclusive cycling groups. But then at the same time, it's kind of looking at it in a positive way of like seeing how much stuff is being done, at the same time recognizing a lot more needs to be done. But sometimes it's nice to kind of sit in a positive way of going, yes, all this wonderful stuff is happening, let's keep it rolling and keep the momentum.
I think it's important to remain positive, like you said, and, you know, momentum is going in the right direction, and that rolling stone will gather no moss and hopefully get bigger and bigger as well. Nikki, something I wanted to touch on there was, so you came back to cycling as an adult there in the UK, and obviously it formed part of what you did as a day job as well. You also, through your university studies, I think were African studies, is that correct?
Yes, they were.
So did that inform the inspiration for your first trip?
As in my 10,000 kilometer trip?
Yeah, sorry, when I say first trip, for your ready, steady, slow trip.
Yeah. Yeah.
The big one, the huge one.
Yeah, no, like, of course. Before I went to university, I traveled to Ghana and I met somebody who now I would consider one of my best friends, Aisha. So then since then, I went back to Ghana quite a few times and have visited quite a few countries in the region. But the route that I took through West Africa basically enabled me to have visited every country in West Africa. So it was quite convenient. But this is the joy of the bicycle, that you're traveling slowly and you can go in whichever direction you want. You don't need to rely on public transport. I mean, I guess people could drive, but that's not as fun. You're not like as close to the action, as it were. So yeah, definitely. I actually had thought about doing, because there's this, I think it's like the Dakar rally. Anyway, so the route is like Paris to Dakar. So I thought about doing that on public transport or hitchhiking or something, like many, many years ago. And so then I kind of based it on that route and then just thought, well, why not go all the way to Ghana? So yeah, but I think I only really decided that I would do that trip maybe about 8 months before I actually left, because it was quite an overwhelming endeavor to think about. But at the same time, living in this little cycling bubble that I live in, I knew that loads of people had done it before. I'd read their blogs, even like, oh, 2, 3 women I've read about have done it before. So it's not even that interesting that I'm doing it, which obviously people would have a different perspective. But still, yeah, the whole trip actually, I guess I thought about it more as I was getting closer to the destination, but I would only plan each country as it was coming. Like I didn't make a route, I didn't plot a route, and I also didn't have like a GPS bike computer, or I literally just would like remember the route, which was a little bit tricky in like Portugal and Spain because there's quite a lot of roads. But then as you go further south, there's less road options. So sometimes, like my choice in Sierra Leone was, do you want the tarmac road or do you want the non-tarmac road? And on that occasion, I chose the non-tarmac road, which brought many adventures, but was really, really hard. But I think you should always choose the non-tarmac road, to be honest. It's much more interesting. Yeah, so I was kind of hopping in my mind from like one country to another. And then the closer I got to Ghana, then I was able to like envisage that I would arrive. And at the same time, I didn't actually tell Aisha that I was doing the trip because it wasn't that I didn't believe that I would arrive, but I just thought it would put on too much pressure. So when I was about halfway through, I was like, hey, Aisha, by the way, I'm currently cycling to Ghana, so it'd be great to see you when I arrive. But I think, yeah, that's how I roll sometimes.
What did she say when she received that? I mean, what communication did you get back?
She's quite a relaxed individual. She was like, oh, okay. Yeah, great. See you when you get here. I think, I
Wow.
can't remember exactly, but something along those lines.
What I loved about a few things that you said there, actually, Nikki, was the idea that you didn't have a set predefined route, but also you chose the way that you chose to travel on a bike because it allowed you to that slow travel of not just exploring a new country or a new landscape or a new culture, but just the way of immersing yourself in it as well. I certainly know it myself, having done some cycle touring, as opposed to other vacations or holidays that I've taken where I've perhaps arrived by train or by car, that they're very different experiences. When you travel on the bike, you're going slow enough where you can all of a sudden see the landscape and the culture and the architecture and the terrain really change all around you. But because you're physically traveling, you're feeling those changes as well. I love the idea that you set out specifically to have such an immersive experience.
Yeah, it was quite liberating in a sense actually because I didn't have a set route. I knew that I wanted to visit all the countries I hadn't visited, so it was like roughly speaking following the edge of West Africa, but not along the coast because there isn't a road that goes the whole way. I had this discussion with so many people. They're like, no, you like on the way, they were like, no, there isn't a road that way, you can't make it. And I was like, no, don't worry, there is. I've done my research. um, but yeah, I didn't have a time frame. So that was quite liberating. But at the same time, I met the woman who's now my wife, unfortunately, like 3 months before I left to do this trip. So there was this little pull of, I don't have a time frame, like I was enjoying myself a lot. But then I guess also this pull of like, I do want to go back at some point and like see them again. And then I guess the longer I was away, I also wanted to come back and kind of see my family and my friends and stuff because it wasn't that I was cycling every single day. There was quite a few hiccups in in my travels, as I'm sure would happen with many people, but it just kind of seemed to drag on and I just felt like I'm not arriving at my destination. And it's not about, of course, it's not about arriving at the destination, but kind of when you have a friend there, it then somehow does turn a little bit into arriving at the destination. But it was just taking a little bit too long. And this might be now why, when an acquaintance introduced me to the ultra cycling world, because he actually asked me, oh, did you race to Ghana? I was like, are you insane? I was like, no, I didn't race to Ghana. And I would never race. I don't know if I would ever race through Africa. I just think it would be such a waste. You'd miss out on so much stuff. Maybe I'd race in one country, like at the moment there's the race around Rwanda. Maybe I would do that. But I just think when you're racing through multiple countries that are not close to you, it just seems like such a waste to do it in that way. But at the same time, maybe that's why I'm more into kind of races like that in the UK or Europe, because then you can kind of see loads of stuff, but in like a short amount of time, and it doesn't feel like it's dragging on.
I'm just trying to think myself. I don't think I could have a racing mindset through Africa.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I feel it's just so starkly different to what I know. The whole point of being there is to just have difference, to observe with curiosity and, absorb as well. And I imagine, your tour. So you called it the Ready, Steady, Slow. Is that correct?
Yeah, which is funny because now I still have that like name on my website, but have delved into ultra distance cycling, but I've written about that a little bit on this blog, but I've just kept that name, which now is a bit of like a juxtaposition. But yeah, I named it that because of this mentality of like not wanting to rush to the end and to experience every country fully. But even so, there's some quite small countries in West Africa, like Guinea-Bissau, for example, which I only spent like 2 weeks in, even though I stopped lots of times, just because it's so small. So you cycle through it quite quickly. But also, yeah, it was also named after this kind of cycling game that we used to do in primary schools of like a slow race. So rather than being the fastest person to get to the line, it actually takes more skill to ride slowly. So it's a slow race. So you go ready, steady, slow, and then you find out whether they've actually listened to the instructions.
Are they races where you're almost having people track stand to not finish?
Basically, yeah. And I've seen videos of like tournaments of this kind of race across the world. Really cool.
I have to say this because it's funny, because one of the thoughts I had when I read that it was Ready, Steady, Slow was it sort of like a funny comedic take on the game show Ready, Steady, Cook.
Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, it does sound like that now that you've said that, but no.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. That's okay. We won't delve into that one, as interesting as a cooking show can be. Now, you did take this tour on solo, but you also travelled with Frida. And I was wondering whether you could introduce our listeners to the love of Frida that you have with you, which is your bike.
Yes, Frida's the best. I feel really sorry for Frida at the moment because she's not really experiencing as much love as now the road bike that I own, which I feel very bad about. But I do ride Frida almost every day, like to commute on. And it's funny actually because at the end of the trip, my wife said, "Oh, you should like frame Frida and put her on the wall." I was like, "Absolutely not. Like Frida must live on."
I love
Frida is how do I want to describe her? I don't want to describe her as a recycled bike. So I built her with my friend Aitor, and we like over half the parts were secondhand. So I was searching for a long time for a frame. I wanted a steel frame because I knew somebody who was cycle touring who managed to break his aluminium frame in half. I didn't really ask the details, but this worried me. So I was like, because I traveled quite a bit in different African countries before, I appreciate that not all of the roads are tarmacked and it can be a kind of bumpy ride. So I really wanted to have a steel frame, and I really like the color purple. So I was like looking for a purple steel frame for quite a long time. But I do have, yeah, quite a lot of friends who are bike mechanics and contacts in different organizations who are kind of recycling bikes. So yeah, so I had a few people looking, and then we found the frame, and then so my friend Aitor used to work for a hire bike, a famous one in London, and he may have borrowed permanently some pieces from these bikes. So for example, the handlebars, not the brakes, which is a bit worrying because the brakes were not very good. So I bought some new like brake levers. But yeah, the handlebars, the grips, and then my wheels were secondhand as well. And then some things were obviously new, like the crank arm and the pedals and the rack, which I have, which is excellent. It was so strong. So yeah, so really like a labor of love, but like building her kind of just a couple of months before I was about to leave, kind of tweaking everything, making it great, putting a giant cassette on the back.
What sort of gearing did you put on?
So it was like a mountain biking setup. So it was a chain ring with 3 gears on the front. And actually, yeah, the cassette wasn't big. It was an 8 speed, but a mountain biking one. So the lowest gear was like much bigger than like a road bike cassette would have been, which proved very helpful in bumpy mountain roads where the incline was like so steep. And I don't know how much my bags weighed, and people would always ask me and I couldn't give them an answer, but maybe like 20 or 25 kilograms was my estimate. So low gearing was really great.
Spin to wind.
Into wind. Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah, I remember writing about that because people would always ask me, like I met some people in, I think, Rabat in Morocco, and one of them was like a road cyclist. So I think it must have been somebody I was staying with through like warm showers or couch surfing. I can't remember who it was or details about them, but their friend was like a road cyclist, and he was like, "Oh, so how far do you ride every day?" And I was like, this is a ridiculous question because it's all about the conditions. So is the road tarmacked? Is there a lot of climbing? Is there headwind? Are there like massive rocks jutting out of the road? Like, it really makes a difference. It's not that you're cycling on smooth tarmac where if there is an incline, it doesn't matter so much. But when you're going up a really steep incline, like, so I think it was in the Anti-Atlas Mountains in Morocco. So there's the High Atlas Mountains, which are the famous ones, like relatively close to Marrakesh. And then there's a mountain range below them that I find really fascinating. I can't remember the dates, but they were made in very different prehistoric times. So the rock formations look totally different. And the Anti-Atlas Mountains, it was kind of not almost desertous, like it's kind of on the border with where the Sahara is beginning. But this one road, I think the maximum length I could cycle was 5 minutes before I had to stop again. So I would get on my bike and cycle for 5 minutes up this crazy road that wasn't tarmacked and was really bumpy and rocky. Obviously, with all the pannier bags on the back. I had a front rack, but that broke really soon on. No, so I think like everything was on the back. And then 5 minutes would pass, and I'd just be like, I can't do this anymore. Let me just stop. Okay, let's go again. And I could see the top of the mountain, and it was just like really far away. But perseverance gets you there. So even with this, like with the really wide gearing range that I had, sometimes it was tough. So yeah, on that day, I don't think I traveled particularly far.
You had some really extreme terrain, and I would say in conjunction with extreme terrain, you also had some extreme weather as well. So your trip started in Santander in Spain, through Portugal, before you crossed over and arrived in Morocco for the West African leg and the bulk of your travel. So straight away in Morocco, you're facing, as you said, you've got the Atlas mountain range and the Anti-Atlas mountains. So straight off the bat, that's extremely difficult terrain. For any cycle tourist, when you're thinking hills, as soon as you put, and you were saying, however heavy your bags were, as soon as the road goes uphill, you notice that. And you do go into a different mental mindset of enduring, and just, you're there for slow travel, you're definitely slow.
Yeah.
But it's not about speed and distances. You keep going, and into some degree it's like ultra racing. It's forward progress is still progress, keep going forward. But then also you then crossing into the Sahara Desert and the sandy terrain and the weather that comes with that. So, sandstorms and whatnot too. But I felt, as I read through your blog, Nikki, another theme which really shone through was the heat that you were cycling to as well.
Yeah, so I left in August, and this was kind of, I'd planned backwards in regards to wanting and needing to cycle through the desert in the winter. So I based everything around this. But it unfortunately meant, and I really wanted to cycle over the mountain. I love mountains. I wanted to cycle over the mountains in Morocco. Whereas other people's blogs I'd read, a lot of people just go along the coast in Morocco, which I think is such a shame. I did the same thing in Mauritania, actually, where I went inland and there it was more mountainous, whereas on the coast it would have been less interesting. But unfortunately, I went over the High Atlas Mountains. Oh my goodness, yeah. And they were resurfacing the road. It was awful. It was so awful, like unimaginable, and like muddy and all these roadworks happening. But it was also November. So it wasn't that there was snow there, but it was freezing. It was freezing cold. And so I was doing really short days. Like one day, I think I did like 40 kilometers because I stopped for lunch in like a roadside restaurant. And the guy was really friendly and I was absolutely freezing. So I'm sitting around the fire. And then he was like, "Do you want to stay here?" And I was like, "Absolutely." Yes, I will. I don't need to go on anymore because it had been raining loads as well. So yeah, so that's kind of the difference. Like the comparison with an ultra race, you'd be like, "No, I've only done 40 kilometers a day. I probably should do a bit more." But when you're like cycle touring, you're like, "Yeah, sure, that's fine. I'll stay." Yeah, so I stayed with loads of people along the way like that. But when I descended from the high Atlas Mountains, like I got a really bad fever just because it had been so freezing cold.
And descending on a cold day, coming down from, because they're, what's the altitude level on the high Atlas?
It's a really good question. I've got a picture, and I don't really like these kind of pictures, but I got to the top of the highest point that I don't think it's the highest point in the high Atlas Mountains, but it's the highest point that I was riding over. I think it was maybe 2,200 meters. But there was this like German tourist bus there, and they just looked at me and went, "Oh my goodness, we must take your photos." And now I have this photo of me next to the sign. I think Tizin Tishka. That may not be correct, but it's like the main road that goes over the high Atlas Mountains.
Quite an elevation to be descending from, and I can only imagine the wind chill coming down.
Yeah, it was chilly, but actually I think I got colder in the Trans-Pyrenees race, to be honest. Because I don't think I had gloves. Yeah, I don't remember it being like freezing, freezing cold. No, maybe I can't remember if I had gloves because the majority of the trip was obviously in Europe. It was in the summer or like early autumn, and then the heat. So the desert actually wasn't really hot. It was so windy. I cycled through a sandstorm at one point. It was just horrendous. Because of my plan, it was winter, so it wasn't that hot. So the desert in the bottom of Morocco, Western Sahara, was quite cool. I was wearing like long sleeves because of the sun, but also kind of for like cultural respect. And then I actually wore the same pair of trousers for like 6 months. And my wife and my friend made me throw them away at the end. I was like, "They're still fine." They're not fine. We've worn them for 6 months.
They didn't get hung on the wall.
But yes, but then as soon as I crossed into Mauritania, then the temperature kind of was starting to rise a little bit more. And so, unfortunately, because there's kind of different seasons depending on which part of Africa you're in, and I find it really interesting to look at maps of like the rainy season. So some places, like in West Africa, have two rainy seasons because the rainy season cloud comes up. Like Ghana kind of has two seasons that are slightly distinct. So it comes up and then crosses through Ghana and then goes further north, and then it comes back for like a second round. But before the rainy season, it's like really hot. So I was also racing to arrive before like the proper rainy season happened in Ghana and the other countries. But so unfortunately, so I left the desert, and then the next few countries weren't too hot. Like Senegal, I don't remember it being like really, it was hot, obviously, but not really, really hot. But then let's see, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau. Yeah, in Guinea, I started really feeling it. And then in Sierra Leone, so along my journey, I wanted to visit different bike projects. And so I visited the Village Bicycle Project in Lunsa in Sierra Leone. So I stopped there for a while, and because I was kind of relaxing, I was like, "Oh, let me just check the weather," because I thought I was ill. Like, I'm getting really ill. What's wrong with me? And then I realized, no, it's just 40 degrees centigrade with humidity. That's why you're so tired.
Lethargy bites at 40 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, so that was challenging.
Can I ask, 40 degrees, but was it also, like, was it dry? Was it humid?
It was humid.
Oh, it'd be the worst.
So I think I drank 5 liters of water a day because in a lot of West African countries they sell water in bags, and sometimes it's 600, but it's usually 500 milliliters. And so then I would count at the end of the day like how many of them I'd drunk. So that's why I got a sense of how much water I was consuming. But then I'd also buy stuff like fizzy drinks as well.
I don't think in 40 degrees and humidity, I'm not sure that you could take on enough water in that. That would be so challenging.
Yeah.
Did you get to a stage where you were adapting to that heat, where you were acclimated to it at all?
I mean, I guess so, because I kept, carrying on, just 40 degrees in particular is quite, yeah, that was a tricky point. So kind of around that season, so maybe a month it was like really, really challenging. And then that's a good question, because either it was that I adapted or that it got a little bit cooler, or maybe a combination of both. I've never thought about that before, but I remember taking a picture of myself in Liberia where I just was like completely soaked. Like I just cycled in like cotton t-shirts a lot of the time. And just the t-shirt was just wet and my face was just wet. It's just so humid. But then at the same time, yeah, kept going. So yeah, I guess I adapted to some respect.
Hi everyone, it's Bella here. Just wanted to say, if you're enjoying what you're listening to so far and liking the podcast, could you please go into your podcast player app and give it a rating and a review? It really helps the podcast to grow and reach a wider audience. Thank you so much. Now, back to the show.
Can I ask, because obviously there were many dirt roads that you took through your tour, no doubt. Did you ever have the combination of wet dirt roads as well, and the joys that comes with cycling through those? I say joys in inverted commas here.
No, I didn't, because that was the point of trying to arrive before the rainy season. So it did rain a little bit the last month or 6 weeks I was riding, and when it rains close to the rainy season, it rains. So you just stop and hide and just wait for it to finish, because unlike in this country, England, where sometimes it can just kind of drizzle or just like rain for hours and hours and hours, usually it's like a really really heavy downpour, and then it will kind of stop after a few hours. So sometimes it's just better to wait. And actually there's one memory I have in regards to that. So when I was in Liberia, I acquired like a plastic sheet, because I said, for when the rainy season comes, like everything's going to get soaked, and me included. So I was carrying this plastic sheet, and then in Cote d'Ivoire, I realized that it was going to rain. So I went into, I'm going to say a forest. I think it was like a kind of farming forest. So I put my bike against the tree, and I sat in between the tree and my bike and put the plastic sheet over my head for a few hours. That was quite fun. But then once it had stopped raining, it was amazing, because I started riding again, and just all of the water, because it was so hot, was just evaporating from the road. You could physically see it all evaporating. It was so beautiful. And then like the sun was coming through all this evaporating water.
Yeah, it's sort of like steam coming off the road. I've seen that phenomenon before, many times in Australia. Nikki, you would have had so many different contrasts on this trip as well. And I don't just mean crossing borders and different countries, but I also mean, so you have the desert, you have the mountains, you're in the coast, dirt roads, tarmac roads, but also, no doubt, very remote locations and small villages to bustling big cities. What was it like going from one to the next?
So the thing that pops into my head first from what you said is, so I feel that I went into cities too often, but I had to, because of visas, because it wasn't possible to get so many visas in advance. So let's see, I think I needed 11 visas. So then it got to the point where I got a few in advance, but I just had to, for the country before, go to the capital of that country and get the visa and then continue. But this was some of my like least fun cycling through big cities. And actually, I think the one that I found the worst was Conakry in Guinea, because the city, it's on, is it a peninsula? Like it's a really long strip of land that's like jutting out into the sea. So it's like a long, thin city, and the point of it is the center, but it just went on forever. And the way that people were driving was like really scary. And there was so much dirt and pollution. So I arrived and I'm just like, my face is covered in muck. And I'm like, I'm alive. So cities, much less fun. The thing is, that was just interesting. So in the desert, obviously, it was quite sparsely populated. But after that, it's just people everywhere. People are just living everywhere. So you would cycle through, like in some of the sub-Saharan West African countries, you'd cycle through a village, but often it wouldn't be that long until you found the next one, which sometimes was a bit tiring. And I think towards the end I got tired, and maybe I wasn't as patient as I had been at the beginning of the trip, because people will constantly want to talk to you. And in Guinea-Bissau it was a bit tricky because I can speak French to a certain degree. So then in all the Francophone West African countries I was able to talk to people, and obviously my French like massively improved throughout the trip. But in Guinea-Bissau they just didn't really know what to do with me, because they speak Portuguese, like a Portuguese Creole. And they were like, oh, you don't speak Portuguese. I don't know what to do with this person. Yeah, trying to like communicate, and yeah, it was a little bit strange. But I do really, and I think maybe my patience waned a little bit, because I do really like being in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I love meeting people, but cycling wise, I love being in the middle of nowhere where no one's around. So just like the constant interaction, and I guess related to the topics that we're both interested in, of like highlighting women cycling, and people just would always ask me, oh, where's your husband or something, or where's your friend, like where's the person that you're cycling with? And so towards the end, that's why I was really starting to kind of crack a little bit, and I was like, it's just me. Oh, where are they? Oh, I can't see them. And there is one incident where I was like, I wasn't very polite, and the man was like, okay, wow, you're rude, which I was, because I'd got so frustrated by that point where I was like, no, you just see me and my bike. No one else is here. So no, I'm not cycling with anyone else. But I do appreciate that it's slightly unusual. And I met loads of different people from like all walks of life. So I think in Morocco, it was like a Dutch motorbike guide. That's quite a thing, where there's all these motorbike tourists that are going around in a group and they have a guide. And he was like, oh, I've done this route, like I guess maybe to Dakar in Senegal, Morocco, etc., loads of times, and I've never seen a woman cycling it, which obviously is untrue because I've read about women who've cycled it. And then people telling me that I was gonna die, that there was no road, etc. And I was like, okay, very good. Nice to speak to you, goodbye.
Thanks for trying to instill a fear that I don't need and put me off. And it's not that you didn't have moments where your heart rate were probably heightened. And perhaps I'm incorrect here, Nikki, and correct me if I am. But would those moments have had more to do with traffic as opposed to what your gender was?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, people were just like confused or surprised was the overwhelming emotion. So I make a point of, when I'm traveling, to always greet people who I think are on the same level as me. So I mean pedestrians and cyclists. Like I don't greet cars, obviously, or like motorbikes.
Hello, car driver.
Hi. So obviously loads of people are like walking around, like between from village to village or whatever. And so I'd always greet people, and often, especially in really like rural areas where maybe they didn't see foreigners very often, their first reaction would be, oh, and obviously I can't show with my facial expression, would look at me and was slightly fear, to be honest, which I totally understand, because it's like, whoa, oh my goodness, what is this person doing? And then I would smile and say hi. And then not all of the time, sometimes people just stayed in this like slightly scared state. But then a lot of the time people were like, oh, and then would become really smiley and like wave and stuff. Yeah, so the large majority of the interactions were really, really nice. So many people offered me a place to stay. Like there are kind people everywhere in the world. And this is always the message that I put out there, because I feel like, especially with, I don't know, films and social media and stuff, we're kind of like taught to trust each other less, and like that the world is a dangerous place, which like it's not really. And yeah, there are kind people everywhere, and of course like not great experiences happen to me, but I can count them on one hand, and they were a little bit related to gender. One of the like lesser ones was, it's quite a few like motorbike taxis in various countries, and just they were not very nice with the things that they said, but it wasn't like aggressive, it was just things that were shouted from a motorbike.
You didn't feel outward hostility.
No. And I think that people try to like scare and shock women out of doing things by themselves, because like, oh, it's dangerous and it's scary. But unfortunately, the world is a little bit of a scary and a dangerous place for a woman to be, because of sexism and misogyny. And so something bad could happen like where you live. So if you're not gonna leave your house or travel, then you're not going to have a fulfilled life. And actually, to be honest, I probably felt like safer during this trip, possibly than I do at home. I'm not sure. I haven't like thought about that, but like I was on the move for like 10 months, like stopping quite a lot of times, and that there were 5 occasions in like 10 months that I felt like a little bit unsafe, or something like not very nice happened, or somebody said something not very nice.
It would be interesting to compare that with 10 months of living day to day life where you are
Yeah,
now.
it would. It would.
Overwhelmingly, the message that I get from other people that I've interviewed as guests of the show who've travelled in these remote areas and different countries and cultures is just that people have welcomed them with open arms and with so much more kindness than they would receive at home.
I agree with that strongly.
It never stops giving me pause for thought. And it always makes me wonder how these interactions change from one country to the next, but also how these interactions probably change from how developed a country is to the next as well. I sort of feel when you travel as a cycle tourist, you're traveling, you're on display there with a potential, with a perception that people see you as vulnerable because you're open to the elements and just the style that you're traveling in. And I wonder whether there's an extra level of kindness displayed to you because of that as well, and whether that changes from people who have had that experience of vulnerability themselves in a developing country as opposed to potentially other areas where that's not necessarily the case. It's just a hypothesis.
I think it's a cultural thing of in England, it's really not that ingrained to like look after travelers or people who are passing, but it just is in other countries. Like it's expected. Like Morocco, it was big style hospitality, and I've heard the same thing from people who've cycled in Morocco. Like there's a code of what needs to happen. So you welcome the person in, you take them to. So a lot of houses have like a kind of hospitality room where like members of their family would sleep. So there's all these long sofas where people sleep on. But even in houses who are less wealthy, who didn't have that room, you bring the person in, you give them tea immediately. And hopefully, if you have something, you give them something with the tea. So like bread and olive oil, or like sweets, or like biscuits or something. But it's like clearly it was a really clear code, because I stayed in Morocco for about 3 months, and like every single person did this. And then it was like, if you do have the hospitality room, oh, you can sleep here. And sometimes I would want to sleep in my tent, just have like a bit of like alone time. But I mean, it just never happened. And the one time I did sleep in my tent, I think I actually got quite offended, because I'd already pitched it, and then they decided afterwards. They were a little bit wary about me. It was kind of 3 families living together, and so the grandma was just like, no, this, I don't know who this like stranger is, like we don't want to stay here, was my interpretation, which I was like, that's totally cool. But they said, yeah, you can pitch your tent. So I did. But then the younger members of the family changed their mind. They were like, no, no, please sleep inside. And I was like, I'm good, thanks, because I've already pitched the tent. So then they brought all of the blankets and pillows and stuff out of the house into my tent, which was great because it was really cold. And then they like made me a fire, and then they brought me all this food. And these were not wealthy people by any stretch. And yeah, it really makes you reflect on it, because we always seem to be like, oh, I don't have enough money to donate to charity, for as like a really basic example, or oh, I don't have this, I don't have that. But so many people I stayed with had like nothing, and they still felt in a cultural way like that they must host me. Like a really crazy story that my wife always says, you have to tell this story. I slept, and I've heard another story from another woman who was cycling through West Africa. So in Guinea-Bissau, where I didn't feel like I was being received like in such a welcomed way, but mostly because of the language barrier. And I understand that people were like, I don't know what to do with this. So I would never ever ask, can I stay inside your house? I would turn up and find somebody and say, hi, can I pitch my tent like close to your house for kind of like safety reasons, and it's good to be around people, and then likely they'll have water, and that would be great. That was my only expectation. And so this village was like being a little bit weird, and then they were kind of proposing that I sleep inside the shop, but the shop was still open. I was like, thanks so much, when's it going to shut? And this woman who they've kind of made her cook for me, which I also found a bit odd. Eventually she was kind of observing the scene and was like, this isn't great. So she said, motioned like, please come and sleep in my house. But I slept next to her baby. So we slept on a double mattress under a mosquito net, but she still had stuff to do. So the baby was already there in the bed, and she was like, "Oh, come sleep next to the baby," which no one in this country would ever do. So then she finishes what she's doing, and then she comes and sleeps next to the baby, and then so the three of us sleep on this mattress. But it was just such incredible kindness that she offered, and it was so empathetic because she saw the scene that was happening and decided in herself. Yeah, it was such an overwhelmingly kind act.
I noticed, Nikki, you wrote in your blog that something you would do when you reached a village was you would approach the village chief.
Yeah, so it depended on the country, and what I understood was the way that things were done. So in certain countries, I realized quite quickly that I would say, "Oh, can I put my tent next to like your house, for example?" And they'd be like, "We need to find the chief," because the chief would likely be the wealthiest person in the village as well. So then I don't know how much their thought processes went in this way, but that was how things are done. Like, you need to go to the chief, and then they'll sort you out. So I definitely did that in Cote d'Ivoire. I don't know. Often I stayed with people where they weren't actually living like in a village. They were kind of just like maybe like a hamlet, like three or four houses or buildings all together. Yeah, so it was kind of a mix. It depended on where I was. But I always approached somebody, and oftentimes, so in Morocco, it was always women who opened the door, because I didn't, now on reflection, I think this is a bit wild that I made this choice. I didn't bring any bike lights with me, but the closer you get to the equator, there's like 12 hours of light hours. So I was only cycling in them. So when dusk was coming, then I would start trying to find somewhere to sleep. And so in Morocco at that time, like the men were still out working. So it would always be a woman who opened the door, which really went in my favor so many times, because they'd be like, "Come on in." And then their husband would come back and be like, "Who's this?" And they'd be like, "She's staying here tonight," or something. But even in other countries, like sub-Saharan West African countries, women would kind of be visible. So maybe outside, like washing or cleaning or whatever. So then it was very easy to approach women to then try and explain the situation. But oftentimes they'd be like, "I don't understand what you're talking about. Let me go get somebody," who then was often male. Yeah.
I'm just blown away. I'm just thinking, you said, was it 8 months or 10 months that you were traveling?
So from start to finish, it was 10 months because of this visa thing. So I stayed in each capital, like every capital city, for at least like 3 days, sometimes more, waiting for the stuff to happen. And then I had this crash, which maybe I'll briefly talk about now. So I got stuck in Senegal for like a month because I collided with, well, it's the taxi's fault. But anyways, I collided with the taxi because it pulled in front of me.
You injured your knee there, didn't you?
I think I hit my right knee on my very strong steel frame, which in this case was not a good thing. And like everything fell out of my bags. People were really nice though. And they like helped me pick up my stuff. But I thought it was fine, so I kept riding on it. I was close to where I was trying to stay that night in Senegal. And then the next day it was only like 40 kilometers to get to Dakar, the capital. But I think I messed up my knee more by doing that. But I had like a couch surfing person to stay with in Dakar. And then I met this other couch surfing, or no, warm showers cycling hosting person. I was really lucky. It was this French like man living there. And then he let me stay with him for like a month whilst my knee was repairing.
Was your travel through each country then dictated by the length of your visas there in a way?
Not really, because I wasn't spending that long. Oh, so with Morocco, yeah, I think I was only allowed to stay in Morocco for 3 months. So I had to leave after 3 months. So I maxed it out, but it was quite close in the end, actually, I think. But no, most of them, I think, gave like at least a month visa or sometimes more. So yeah, that wasn't ever really something I had to consider. Some of the visa costs were extortionate. Liberia was the most expensive. I can't remember how much it was, but possibly something in the region of like 150 US dollars. It was wild.
What can you do?
You can't do anything. And also
No.
a really good way for the country to make money. But I can't imagine that that many people are getting visas for Liberia.
I don't think it's the top of the destination list somehow. But I wonder then, did you get homesick?
I never thought that I would, but yeah, I think in the end I was a bit homesick, to be honest. I've lived in different countries before, but I guess always being on the move is quite tiring. And the way that I was traveling, so always interacting with people a lot, for not really having time by yourself on the bike, but even not that much time because there was always people on the road that wanted to interact with you. So I think, yeah, I think I did, yeah, get a little bit homesick.
Do you feel then when you arrived back at home, you were ready to be there?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I think I found it really challenging. I found it really challenging when I came back because obviously I'd been living this very kind of nomadic life where, similar to an ultra distance race, all you have to think about is where you're going to sleep, drinking enough and eating enough. It's actually a really nice existence. And then, okay, so then interacting with people and kind of planning your route. And then, yeah, the additional thing of thinking about visas. But it just, like, everything was so simple. And I can't actually really remember the details of how I felt when I came back, but I do remember that I found it quite difficult.
It's sort of like, a post-holiday blues or post-event depression or something like that. I'm not saying you were depressed by any measure, but there is definitely a come down from when you've had something that's been such a big focal point of yours just come to an end.
Yeah, definitely. And I think because there was so much time, I mean, okay, a relatively short time in a sense of like 8 months of like preparing for it, but it was on my mind for all of those 8 months. And actually, I realized that my memory in the few months before I left is really hazy because I think I was quite stressed of like trying to get everything ready that I've forgotten a lot of things. So yeah, you describe it well that it was like a kind of, yeah, a come down of, oh, I like achieved what I wanted to achieve, and there we go, let's go home now, and then also work out what I was doing at home.
It's interesting because it wasn't that I don't believe you went straight into this, but you finished your tour and then, slow travel, beautiful, reliable steel bike, taking on heavy loads and whatnot, and making your way slowly from one destination to the next. I mean, you then found yourself with a road bike. Very, very different style of cycling all of a sudden comes into your life. I know we've spoken about your ultra races, but something that came up that I read about, which I was fascinated with your blog, was your introduction into the British cycling hill climb scene and hill climb races. Can you just explain those for our listeners who may not be aware of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's actually not British cycling, it's cycling time trials. Um,
Oh, sorry. Australian here.
yeah, so hill climbs are a very like, as I guess it be a British thing, which I haven't seen replicated in other countries. And when you speak to other people about it, they're like, "Oh, okay." So it's a time trial from the bottom of a hill to the top of a hill, and obviously the winner is the person who does it in the quickest time, and was always a very male dominated, quite niche bit of the cycling sport. And so I got into it in a wave, which is still continuing, of an ex professional female cyclist really pushing for more women to join the National Hill Climb Championship, which is usually, is it like the end of October or beginning of November? So, right at the end of the season, as it were. So yeah, so that's what I kind of realized actually during my trip to Ghana, that I was naturally quite good at cycling up hills with like, not, of course not minimal effort, but it just came to me quite naturally. Whereas cycling on the flat, it's not my favorite thing. And I'm also not that good at it. Like, I'm not as fast as other people by any stretch. So I sort of accidentally realized that I can cycle uphill quite fast. But transitioning to a road bike is quite a fun story because I think her name's Laurie Pestana. So she put out this campaign to try and get a 50-50 split in the National Hill Climb of 2020, which obviously is when COVID was, and not much had been going on. So I was like, yes, I want to do this. And initially I thought I was going to do it on Frida, but then as I'm researching a bit more about hill climbs, I realized that this is a big no-no. So I need to get a road bike, which I did manage to get.
I'd love you to do one on Frida, though.
Yeah.
Frida's up for it.
I mean, of course, she definitely is. But also a note to make, actually. So before I left on my trip to Ghana, my friend Aitor said, "Oh, are you gonna use what do you even call them? Clipless pedals? Yeah, like clip-in pedals," which I'd never ever used. So I said, "No, of course I'm not going to do that." So I used flat pedals the whole time. now I understand like the benefits of like clip pedals. But yeah, so then that's also what I needed to do. I needed to source a secondhand road bike, which luckily I did. Then I also needed to acquire some pedals and shoes and learn how to use them. So because of all of my like contacts, my friend Charlie gave me some pedals and shoes. So I was like learning how to do that. And obviously, as with everybody, fell off loads of times. And so usually with hill climb time trials, you're already clipped in and you have somebody holding your seat post like that. But because it was COVID times, you basically had the option of starting with one foot on the floor and clipping in, which I was like, absolutely not. I can barely clip in, or holding onto this post and pushing off. And they recorded it because it was the National Hill Climb. So basically, it looked like I was about to fall over because I swerved so much to the left-hand side when I started. And my wife was watching and was thinking, oh my goodness. Okay, she's fine. So then off I went. And I started off quite relaxed. And obviously, like, there were some people dotted along the route who were cheering and stuff and have cowbells. So then, yeah, put in like a bit more effort. But I realized at the end, obviously I didn't like get a high ranking, but I was like midfield. I was like, this is pretty good. I've just like just got a road bike, learned how to ride clipped in, and kind of gave like an average effort. Maybe I should do this more. And I think, oh yeah, so I signed up for the Trans Pyrenees ultra distance race. I think it was February 2020. So obviously it was quite clear that that wasn't going to happen. But I had it in my mind anyways that I needed to get a road bike. And so that race was actually delayed by like 2.5 years, that when they finally managed to do it. So quite a big run up. So yes, but it was also because my feeling about people that ride road bikes are like, I can't even say the word that I want to say to describe them.
I think I'm thinking the words you want to say to
Not
describe them. And I
something that I
say that
want
as someone who rides a road bike. I
yeah,
ride
yeah.
all bikes, putting that out there, but I think I know exactly what you want to say.
Yeah, but not really wanting to be like viewed in that way, because especially with all the cycling instructing I did, and there's some very passionate cycling instructors in London who really want to make cycling for everybody. And so it really seemed like counter to what I'd been like, I don't want not preaching, but been spreading the word of. Um, but yeah, but then obviously you have a different experience with the road bike, and then delving into ultra distance racing. Obviously, it's very helpful.
I wonder though, like, and again, it goes back towards your passion of, and advocating in minorities and stuff. It's breaking down those perceptions and stereotypes and barriers, and it goes hand in hand with that. It's different to the scene that you started with, but that shouldn't be a reason why you can't participate in it now. And I think that's fantastic. I have to admit, when I started off cycling, I think I talked myself out of being good at climbing hills. And so then I focused on them, and then I actually that's what I love doing. I now live in the Pyrenees, for crying out loud. But I always say I'd prefer to ride up a hill twice than actually to have to descend it. Descending's not for me for one reason or another. And I certainly don't like the flats. The hill climb scene is something that I could see I could get into. because
Yeah,
because it is just that uphill. I don't have to worry about the downhill. I can just focus all out effort. It's so intense.
it's like kind of a really inclusive part of the sport. And I always try and tell this to people, but I don't think they quite believe me, because it's a time trial. You're not like racing against anyone else, like you're racing against yourself. And just the support of people, because now it's, COVID has kind of, moved on, hopefully, but that loads of supporters are allowed to be along the roadside now, which really has a different experience. And so I say to people, you will cycle up that hill faster than you could ever imagine that you would, just because everyone's so supportive of every single person who's riding up. Like it's such a really nice environment. And you do questions sometimes where, so the hill climb, most of them take between like 3 and 6 minutes, depending on the length of the hill. And you're like, it takes up a good half a day just to compete for like 5 minutes, but it's so worth it.
I've heard there's really good cake stalls at the hill climbs as well.
Oh yeah, that as well.
That's really what it's about.
Exactly.
Actually, pop quiz. What's you're at a hill climb cake store. What's the cake you're looking out for?
Oh, like basically anything, but not a fruit cake. I would be really disappointed if there was only fruit cake. I mean, can be anything really, like a red velvet, a chocolate cake, a carrot cake. I'm not fussy. I'm also technically vegan, but when it comes to cake, I'm not because I
I
don't.
love it. Oh, I love that you've got an exception for cakes. I'm here craving like a lumberjack cake or a carrot cake with like cream cheese icing really thickly on the top or something like that. But or a cinnamon bun
Nice.
actually. No, cinnamon bun. That's
Oh
me.
yeah, they're good as well.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
cinnamon.
the nice cuppa. So Nikki, and again, it's interesting because if I look back at your experience with the bicycle, there's so many different. They're so contrasting. You've got your long distance tour through West Africa, these short, sharp, intense efforts on the hill climb scene, to then ridiculously long days and hard kilometres in your ultra endurance cycling events. And especially when you look at the hill climb scene of something, 3 to 6 minutes to then all of a sudden signing up for the Trans Pyrenees, which is quite a lot further than 3 to 6 minutes. Can you explain how you came into the ultra cycling world?
Yeah, but just to draw on the point that you just made, someone did did bring this to my awareness. I think it was only a few months ago. They were like, Nikki, you do two really A, contrasting and B, quite niche parts of cycling. Hill climbing, which, as you say, is like short, sharp efforts. I guess it's essentially kind of like a sprint, but up a hill. And I'm not a sprinter, but it's somehow I have the legs for it. But then also like the ultra endurance stuff. And I think it's, yeah, the person who, Thomas, who introduced me to ultra distance cycling. So we actually both signed up individually to the Trans Pyrenees race, but unfortunately he wasn't able to do it in the end. But I guess he saw this in me, that from cycling to Ghana, kind of this like hardiness. I would consider myself like a hardy, like tough person. And I guess the difference between, because I know lots of people who do really long distances, like in a day, and the whole Audax scene of, yeah, doing like 300 kilometers or maybe 400 kilometers like in a day. But I guess the difference is the kind of fending for yourself in an ultra endurance race, and when things go wrong, not letting it be a total disaster. So I guess that does take a different mindset.
A self sufficient mindset, and which, if I think about it, your trip through West Africa would have been perfect building blocks for.
Yeah, it seems so.
You were saying tough's not the right words, but potentially it's the grit and I don't mean endurance, because obviously with ultra cycling there's certainly an endurance element that goes into it, and certainly with the style of touring you were doing there's a certain element of endurance as well. But I mean endurance as in the ability to continue to endure, not from a physical point of view, but mentally to keep focus and resolve and to keep going when things potentially go against.
And maybe like perseverance, because
Perseverance,
I,
definitely.
yeah, because of course, like to do the Trans Pyrenees, you need to have been cycling a certain amount. You need to be somewhat prepared because it's absolutely wild. So I had to pull out of the race because I got this condition called Schirmer's neck, where your neck muscles just fail, and I actually feel like I brought it on from being tense and stressed. But where I stopped, I'd done 1,100 kilometers and I'd done 26,000 meters of climbing, which I think was roughly like 26 cols, like 26 mountain climbs, which is crazy. So obviously you need to be a certain amount of fit, but with ultra endurance races, and actually I guess like long distance touring, so much of it is mental. Like I had loads of like mental struggles during my trip to Ghana, thinking that I couldn't do it, feeling really lonely actually at a lot of times. Yeah, it was a bit of a roller coaster. And the same can happen in ultra endurance races, where you're like having the best time ever and then something goes wrong and it's the worst time ever. But like the mental challenge for me is such a bigger percentage of what is needed than the physical one. Because yeah, I guess an anecdote of somebody I was cycling with and in France, and we were going to Barcelona, And so this man said to her, like, oh, where are you going? She said, oh, we're going to Barcelona. And he was like, you're not going to make it to Barcelona on that bike. She wasn't riding a very good bike. But I realized in that moment that anyone can cycle any distance, just if there isn't a fixed time frame. Like, you'll get there as long as you believe that you can. So yeah, like anyone in theory could like cycle to Australia. It might take someone like 10 years. It might take somebody else like a year or 6 months or something crazy. But that it's your mind that is getting you there. And I guess a final thing with touring, because people always ask me, oh, did you train before you like cycled to Ghana? I was like, no, I didn't do any training. And I have this really mixed relationship with the word training. And at the moment I'm sort of, I guess, training, just because now I have an office job. So I have the realization where in the last years it was so like I barely trained, quote unquote, because I was working on my feet or on my bicycle the whole day, every day. But now I kind of have to put in a little bit extra effort because I am sitting at a desk like 3 days a week. But with cycle touring, every day you're getting stronger. And I've said this to so many people so many times. I don't know how much they actually believe me, but okay, you start off and maybe on the first day you don't really go a long distance, and that doesn't really matter because then you'll build it up to whatever distance you want to go. Also, you might decide that you don't need to cycle a long distance. It might be a holiday, you might be wanting to get to a certain place, like you make the boundaries of what you want to do. But cycle touring, definitely, yeah, every day you're just getting stronger, so you don't need to train.
You could almost set out on a cycle tour. I'm not advising people to do this, but you could ride yourself into fitness on a cycle tour, I think.
Yeah, to a certain extent, definitely.
Exactly. And it is about the head game. A favourite quote of mine I got given, it was actually by a mechanic a few hours before I started my first ultra cycling event last year, and it was a French mechanic, and he said the saying in French is commencer avec les jambes, finir avec la tête. So you start with the legs and you'll finish with the head. And it's so true. Like, I just remember that so starkly, and the amount of times I thought, my goodness, how true was that for myself in that event and everyone, because it's the legs that get you started, but it's the head that's going to get you to that finish line.
That's a great quote.
Oh, it's not mine, but I use it, but feel free. I know we've been talking for so long, but I did want to talk about your ultra cycling and how you did transition and prepare yourself for the Trans-Pyrenees. And I know it was delayed for, was it 2.5 years from when you originally signed up to when you got into the date. But how did you keep yourself motivated for something that kept getting put off?
Oof, I mean, both times that it got cancelled, I had a small celebration because I wasn't ready. I hadn't booked my flights. I hadn't reserved any accommodation. So the first year, in 2020, it was really clear that it wasn't going to happen. But 2021, it was so uncertain for such a long time whether or not it was going to happen. I guess, as I've touched on before, because of my very active work, I was naturally quite fit just from and used to being outside. But I did realize that, okay, this is quite a big endeavor. So let's just make sure that you're ready. And now, yeah, people from my cycling club or people that want to get into endurance cycling, they often ask me, how should I prepare? So I kind of struck some luck, really, that I found out about the event that they don't call a race, but some people race it, All Points North, which is a kind of 1,000-kilometer free route where you visit 10 different points in the north of England. And so I got a last minute place on that in, now my dates are really confused. No, that was 2021. So that was supposed to be just before the Pyrenees. So it would have been my introduction to. So I did that one first, which was quite a good introduction because it was like 1,000 kilometers in like really, really hilly terrain, but not quite as much as the Trans-Pyrenees. And then I'm not very motivated by cycling in a circle, which is what a lot of cycling clubs do. And it's nice because you're with other people and it's convenient because you can do it in half a day or a day. But I'm most motivated by cycling point to point. So my brother-in-law lives in Birmingham. My sister-in-law lives in Brighton. So I cycled to Birmingham via a route that was maybe like 190 kilometers. Then I stayed there for a few days and then I cycled back. That set me up quite nicely. And then what I think is really important with ultra endurance cycling is at some point, even if you stay in a hotel, you are going to be cycling at night for a certain amount of time. So it's really good to get experience of cycling at night. And in England, London, southeast direction, the Dunwich Dynamo gives you just this experience. It's an event where people cycle from Hackney in East London to Dunwich, which is in Suffolk, I believe, on the east coast of England. And it's 200 kilometers, and you start a little bit before sunset, maybe starting from 6. Some people leave at 6 or 7 or 8, and then you cycle through the night, and then you arrive there in the morning. So that was a really good thing for me to do. So I guess, yeah, so I must have done the Dunwich Dynamo first before I did All Points North for the first time. That makes sense. And then I decided to cycle back, because you're not allowed to put your bike on the train, because there's sometimes 1,000 people that do this event. So they say no bikes on the train. So I cycled back. So then on that day, I did 400 kilometers in 24 hours, which for me psychologically was very, very helpful, because then in the future, I could say to myself, even though it was basically a relatively flat route, but it was really helpful for me to know what I was capable of doing. And so I would kind of urge people trying to get into ultra distance racing of establishing this for yourself, of what you are able to do, and then you can use that in the future to be okay, well, this time I cycled 300 kilometers in less than 24 hours, or 200 kilometers in some space of time, so I can try and do that again. Or then it allows you to be able to maybe estimate how quickly you might do something. Obviously, things will always happen, and you might go much slower or you might go much faster than your plan, but it's sometimes nice to kind of get a sense of what you personally are able to do, because I think even people who are properly racing ultra distance races, it's still all about yourself. And I was reading a quote, I can't remember from which race, because they're both on at the same time, so either the Atlas Mountain race in Morocco or the race around Rwanda, but somebody was saying that I think they'd done well in a previous version of the race, but they said nothing is given in that kind of scene, so the main aim is to finish. And so this is what I'd always said in all of the things that I'd done. The Trans-Pyrenees, a different thing happened in my head, because then when I realized that I was actually doing very well, I think that's actually what stressed me out. There was lots of things that made me tense, and then the Sherman's neck happened. One of them was not being so skilled in descending and feeling quite nervous about it. And I descended more than I have done in my entire life, because I probably descended 26,000 meters or something.
Most certainly you would have.
Yeah.
Because what goes up goes down on that race course. It's crazy, isn't it?
That's unbelievable.
And how many days was that? Because, Nikki, unfortunately, as you said, you did have Sherman's neck and an injury which ultimately meant that you had to scratch from the race. But how many days and how far did you get through that Trans-Pyrenees event?
That's a good question. So I know that I finished at 1,100. So it was technically the longest distance I'd cycled in one sitting, only by 70 kilometers, but at least it was the longest one. But it was
Be proud of it.
Yeah, but it was also the longest that I'd been continuously cycling, because obviously, because the Pyrenees is a mountain range, so you're going slower than you would be otherwise. So I think it was halfway through day 5, because that race starts really early in the morning, 6 a.m. And I think I decided that I couldn't go on anymore at about 4 p.m.
You were on your way back through the Raid Pyrenees route by that stage, weren't you?
Yeah, so I maybe did about a third of that route. It was a really hard decision, because the thing is that I'd never had to leave a race. Well, this was only the third one that I'd done. And I never understood up until that moment why people left races. And for me, it was that I couldn't see the road in front of me.
Because of the Sherman's neck.
Yeah, so I cycled longer than I should have done, but I couldn't see forwards.
And pretty much, for those listening who haven't heard of Sherman's neck, it pretty much is the muscles that hold your head up, your neck,
Yeah.
just don't have the ability anymore to do that.
Yeah, so it's basically a repetitive strain injury, and actually you can feel them. So if you grab the back of your neck at the top, just underneath your skull, you'll feel that there's two kind of long ones going down your neck, so they just weren't working. It set on so quickly, so it was in a moment of like intense stress for me where I can't remember the name of any of these coals in the Pyrenees, but it was two massive ones back to back, which was quite unusual. Up until that point that hadn't happened, and it was really hot and I was dehydrated and there was no refill point in between them, so I just had to go for it. And then I was trying to get to this hotel that I'd booked in advance, which if I did that race again, I wouldn't book anything in advance because that is what caused me extra stress. So I was trying to rush to it and I was still about, and I remember that, so it was dark and I was on like basically a kind of single track road and two riders went past me, and then I realized that I couldn't turn to look at them, and I recognized one of their voices, like I'd met him before. And so I just like shouted to them, like, I can't lift my head up. But obviously they were moving faster than me, so they didn't hear me. And then I met another rider and I said, I'm trying to get to the town. Also can't remember the name of where it was. Oh,
Tarascon-sur-Ariège. Yeah, it's a beautiful town, actually.
Yeah, no, I saw that. I didn't have the chance to like look around it loads, but I did manage to get there. But I just remember him saying to me, because he could see I was in so much distress, he was like, I'm so sorry, but it's like 20 kilometers away. And I thought I was going to lose my reservation, which I didn't in the end. It was all fine. But just so I couldn't look up. And when I was trying to, obviously, because it's the Pyrenees, there's loads of like hairpin turns and you need to look around the corner when you're turning. And so I had to force my head to the sides, but it was in doing that, it was making my mouth open in this way. It was very strange. So basically I like arrived and I slept there, like ate lots of food, overslept in the morning, was a bit annoyed at myself, and I carried on, and it was fine in the morning because I'd rested, but then it was also quite flat out of that town. And so then I did one climb, it was fine, or two, I think two, and the second one was great. I think something to do with Agnes, really lovely climb.
Yeah, Col d'Agné.
That
Yeah.
one of my favorites. But then the last one I did, also can't remember the name of it. Sorry, it's really inconvenient for listeners. But then my head, like I couldn't hold it up. Yeah, I cycled with a guy called Samuel the whole way up. He was also in the race, so we cycled next to each other. And I was like, I'm really sorry, I can't turn my head to look at you, but let's chat as we go up this col. I was like, this is really dangerous. And I actually cycled into a parked car. I think people were picking mushrooms. I was like, this is really stupid. But it was really upsetting, like acknowledging that I had to leave because I kept trying to carry on. And my wife I rang her and she was saying to me, just think about how you're going to feel if you leave the race. Like, is it impossible that you carry on? And I was like, I think it's looking that way. Yes. And I'm really glad that I did leave the race because it was so unsafe.
It's not an injury. Yeah, it's not an injury that I think you can cycle safely or continue to be safe on the road, especially in that terrain. You mentioned how you couldn't turn to look at the person cycling next to you, and when you're descending down a mountain and you need to turn your head to look through the corner to descend, to not be able to do that, to cycle into the back of a car, it's a big sort of neon sign flashing in front of you in a way to say you probably shouldn't continue to do this. But nonetheless, a hard decision to make.
Yeah, no, it was really hard. So I like descended from that call and went to a pharmacy and tried. I have a few friends that are doctors, so I rang them all and they said you could try these things, but it was too late. It had already happened. And so then I had the realization. I carried on a little bit longer, stopped, carried on a bit more. And so when you really need to scratch, so scratching from a race is when you drop out of the race and then you inform the race organizers. So when you really have to scratch, it's not going to be in a convenient location. I was really in the middle of nowhere, got to a village, found a camping place that was closed technically, but they let me stay there in a teepee, which is quite fun. And then their friend gave me a lift to the train station the next day because I was like, but I can't cycle out of here. And there wasn't a train station nearby. And so I'm so glad that I stopped at that point because so in order to get to the train station, we rode up the next col that was going to be on the route. And the descent of it was so steep and so narrow. And there was like a truck driving up it, or like a lorry or something driving up it as we were driving down it. And I thought, I've really made the best decision here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's not through lack of will to want to be at the finish line, but there's times where it's taken out of your hands through an injury like that.
Yeah.
I have to ask, do you feel then with the Trans-Pyrenees in particular, there's unfinished business there? Like, and maybe you have, like, is it a race that you want to return to? Have you signed up for the next edition?
This is the topic of the
It's only
moment.
just opened up, I
I
think.
know, I know. Yeah, it's the topic of the moment. So my wife insists that I have to do it, and various friends have asked me, "Are you going to do it?" I think you should. Yeah, the thing is with that race, so as I said before, I accidentally realized that I'm quite good at climbing mountains on a bike and hills. And so I really feel that this race fits with what I'm good at doing. And I really enjoy I love being in the mountains. I really enjoyed it. It was the first race I'd done where there was a set route, so you got to hang out with people all the time. And I actually didn't think I'd enjoy that as much as I did. I was reflecting actually on once like outside a bakery, and it's quite a lot of French riders. I think there's about like 8 of us just like hanging out in front of this bakery. It was, yeah, really, really nice. Yeah, I think I probably should. I think the reasons I'd give for not doing it are kind of stupid and can be tackled. Basically, I'm afraid. I'm so afraid that the same thing's going to happen again, or that I won't be able to finish, and then what that will do to my mentality. But after I came back, like the ultra distance cycling community, if you can call it that, is so nice. So people instantly put me in touch with other people who'd had Sherman's neck in the past, or the people to talk to. And so I talked to this man whose name I've forgotten now, who got Sherman's neck 3 times on the transcontinental race, and then after we spoke, he'd just done it the 4th time and managed to complete it. I was like, that is perseverance, because I would be so upset if that happened even a second time. But it happened to him 3 times, and then finally on the 4th time he managed to complete the race. So yeah, so I probably haven't put in my application as yet, but
I can tell you that if I see your name on the start line, you'll see my crazy hair somewhere on the side of the road.
oh yeah, that would be great. I would
The
love
route goes so close to my village, it would be impossible for me not to cheer you on, that's for sure. Oh my gosh, Nikki, I really just want to keep talking to you. I'm just fascinated with all the stories that you can tell, but I realise I'm taking up so much time. Quickly, I have 2 questions which I always finish up my show with, which I ask all my guests. And I have a sneaking suspicion I personally know the answers you will give me to both these questions, but I have to ask them anyway.
that.
First one is, if you had to choose between cycling up a mountain or a climb all day, or cycling into a brutal headwind, which one are you going to choose?
Always up, always up a mountain, because I have experienced cycling into a brutal headwind on the flat so many times. It's so unenjoyable. Or actually, what's maybe slightly worse is side wind, because it's terrifying.
Oh, crosswinds for sure. Oh, actually, crosswinds coming down a mountain. I think that's probably the worst
Oh
combination.
yeah, no, but always up a mountain.
And my next quick question is, if you had the choice that you're going to be cycling for 4 hours one day and you could cycle on your own or cycle with others, what are you choosing?
It's so bad. Always, I would always choose to cycle by myself, and I feel so bad because sometimes people are like, "Oh yeah, we should cycle together," and I'm like, "Mm-hmm." No, I think, especially with like joining a cycling club, I am coming round to cycling with people more often, and I do appreciate that it is really fun, and especially when you're cycling a long distance. So our club, Bricks and Cycles, organised a 200-kilometer Audax, and I did it quite recently after having COVID, so I was not super energized, and I rode it, most of it, with my friend Max, and it was so helpful to have each other to kind of egg you on. So I do understand in ultra distance races when people ride as a pair, because you get that extra thing, but there's still, I just love riding by myself. Like one of my favorite places in this country is like the Highlands of Scotland, and I keep trying to go back there and it never works out in my calendar. But I just love riding in Scotland in the middle of nowhere by myself. So I'll say mixed.
Proper beautiful wild country up there as well, to just be lost with your own thoughts and having time with yourself. It's nature's medicine.
Yes,
That's how
exactly.
I sort of see it as well. Nikki, if people want to follow along with what's next for you and see whether you've signed up for the Trans-Pyrenees, how can they find you out there? How can they follow along?
So I have Instagram, which is adventure-cyclist Nikki, Nikki. Yeah, and I do have a blog that is called readystedyslow.wordpress.com, where you can read mostly about my cycle to Ghana, but I've also have a kind of listing of podcasts I've spoken on and a few things I've written on there as well.
Fantastic. Well, I will definitely provide links to both of those in the show notes for all our listeners so they can keep in touch with you. Nikki, it has been an absolute pleasure to listen to you talk about the adventures that you've had with the bicycle and what you're doing with the bicycle. I know that I'll certainly be keeping my eyes peeled to see when you visit my part of the world here in the French Pyrenees. No pressure. The sign-ups have reopened.
Not at all. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been really nice to talk to you.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bella.
If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review. It really helps the podcast to grow and reach a wider audience. Also, feel free to share it with others and post about it on your social media. Lastly, do you have your own story you'd like to share with us? Then please get in touch by sending an email to podcast@seektravelride.com and request to be featured as a guest on the show. Until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.